Hi everyone! Diablo 4 Season 4 changes the way the game works and how we play it significantly. There are insane updates to itemization, crafting, the endgame, and all of that starts at level 1. As you can see here, for example, this is a test run I've been doing on my rogue here on the public test room, and you can now, for example, do Helltides in World Tier 1 and World Tier 2. And it's just like one of the few changes that they have made that impacts you right from the start. There are more changes to how you're gonna level up most efficiently in the future. It's no longer domain ton meta. And there's also lots of other little things that kind of smooth out the experience that you can do better or worse. So I want to go over that in this video and talk about the leveling strats and how to get to the 100, where now the game actually starts. There's a lot to unpack in this video here, so I can be paired with screenshots, numbers, and of course, my nerdy glasses, because we're about to go deep. And that brings us to the sponsor of today's video, GMG Performance. So before we dive really deep, I want to give them a shout out, because those are the guys who actually sent me those glasses. They've already sponsored me in the past. You might have seen another video of mine where I was wearing these glasses, and here and there I'm actually also wearing them on my stream. So I can say I'm quite happy with their product. Especially my Twitch viewers will know about my channel point redeem that I have here, but I do use them actually frequently, even off stream. For example, right before bedtime, because those glasses are not just any glasses, they're actually blue light filter glasses, which allow you to protect your eyes and get a better night's rest after stream or after playing video games. In the past, we spent a lot less time in front of PC screens. In 2010, that number was around 3 hours per day on average. These days, that's over 7 hours on average. And that obviously takes a toll on your health, including your eyes. But that doesn't have to be the only reason. Even if you feel totally fine, those glasses can help you to improve your concentration, reflexes, and performance. If you go to the GMG Performance website, you can find all of their products there. They have 4 different lines of glasses. The one that I'm wearing right now is the Oranos model. And they also have other nice stuff here, like the sleep gummies that kind of go well with that. Those gummies are filled with melatonin and passiflora that help you relax and fall asleep way easier. Personally, I don't actually need glasses for my eyesight, but I have fully embraced those gaming glasses with the blue light filters for my well-being. And I can only recommend you to try them out yourself. And if you use my link in the description or the pinned comment below, you can get up to a 40% discount in the next 48 hours after the release of this video. So go check them out now and secure your discount. And now let's continue with the video. So to get back to the topic of leveling up your character most efficiently in Season 4, there are a few changes that you have to consider from past seasons to Season 4. Number 1, I talked about the Helltide, but also there is a new itemization now that will start affecting you from level 1, generally making you stronger than before, I would say. And also they have changed the experience values in the different world tiers. World Tier 1 now has 0% bonus, just like before, but World Tier 2 already has 50% bonus, which previously was 20%. And World Tier 3 has, I believe, 150, and World Tier 4 has 250% bonus. So in general, it is kind of worth going to the higher difficulties more than before, especially the difference between World Tier 1 and World Tier 2 has shifted quite a bit, to the point where you don't really ever want to stay on World Tier 1 anymore. This is only going to be a thing really for the newcomers that, play the game for the first time, or just, have like a really weak build, or just want to really chill or something like that. But in the grand scheme of things, World Tier 2 is going to be the way. It was already the way because at some point Blizzard had buffed the drops a little bit there, but now with this 50% bonus XP, there's really no question about it. And then comes the Helltide, and as you can see here, it has been kind of like buffed up with lots of different little things. There's like elite spawning all the time now. You have this Helltide meter here as well, where at some point you're gonna fill it up and there's like hordes of enemies spawning on you. And there's gonna be these new Hellborn monsters that at least in the later world tiers can drop boss materials and lots of loot. And there's in general like more density, more events, more stuff to do. Sometimes there's this worm coming out of the ground, spitting out monsters. However, in World Tier 1 and 2, this is not as crazy as it gets later in World Tier 3 and World Tier 4, where all this stuff is at a full capacity. But overall, it makes it so that it's still worth going to Helltide instead of Domain Tunnel. And that is kind of the important part here. One other neat change that you can see here is also that they have changed how the mystery chests work in World Tier 1 and World Tier 2 as well. So every single chest will be the same mystery chest for 100 cinders. So this is not like you go around and you open like an armor chest, a weapon chest or whatever, and then later living steel. You don't actually get living steel in the early Helltides, but instead you can just open these boxes here. And in fact, they actually scale with your level, and you can see that my experience bar just raised by like half a level almost, or something like that, when I was level 13, just from opening this chest. Now, it does take a while to get those cinders. For example, in my test run, I think I managed to open like 5 chests or so in like the first Helltide, which lasts 55 minutes, or 5 or 6 chests or so. But even that counted together is like 2.5, 3 levels or so that you just kind of get for free. On top of getting a bunch of item upgrades as well, because every time those chests actually pop out, like, you know, 3 yellows here, like random stuff. And like this, you can kind of like keep pace with the items that you're wearing with the levels that you are actually fighting. But another thing is also that those chests scale with the character level as well. So you kind of can just collect cinders and then open those chests later when you really need item upgrades, and when, for example, the monsters are kind of like a lower level. So you see this here, for example, my character is level 13, almost 14 at this point. And yeah, actually leveled up. So this guy is level 11, and 3 levels below my character, I get 30% less XP already. This is because at the start, you level up so fast that the surrounding monsters don't really keep pace unless you change instance or you go to the next zone or something like that, and then stuff will kind of equalize out again with your character. But if you stay in the same zone and then every few minutes you get a level up, you're kind of gonna over level to the surrounding monsters basically. And the chests kind of just scale with your own level, so the later you open them, the better. Now the thing is that Helltide is especially good early on, but then kind of like falls off later in terms of experience gains compared to other systems, especially the Nightmare Dungeons. If you don't know, Nightmare Dungeons get an 80% experience bonus, and that also applies to the pit in the future. So we had Rax, who had actually been testing this a little bit on the PTR. So this is like some of these numbers I'm going to go into in a second here. And I've been talking to him about this. And it turns out that Nightmare Dungeons and also later the pit towards level 100 are still going to be the way once you are in Nightmare difficulty. But at least for World Tier 2, all the way to like level 40 or something like that, whenever you can go and do the Curator, this is going to be the content that you farm. I tried this out myself actually. For example, here is like the same rogue later when I defeated the Curator around 2 hours in. I was level 35, so it was pretty early, but I specifically tried to go very early because the power level of builds is also much higher in Season 4, especially with tempered mods. But it turns out that going to the Helltide in World Tier 3 compared to World Tier 2 when you're underleveled is just extremely hard. Like those monsters are level 58 minimum because they are like the minimum 55 plus 3. And also there's a lot of stuff going on in Helltide suddenly. So while it's very good in World Tier 2 to get to World Tier 3, you don't actually want to continue in the Helltide, and you want to go to Nightmare Dungeons as soon as possible. In order to do Nightmare Dungeons, you have to do 1 round of Whispers so you can get a sigil, and then once you get your first Tier 1 Nightmare Dungeon sigil, this is where you will go. Helltides will stay relevant because later on you're going to get Living Steel here. However, for leveling up, it's not really that relevant, and Living Steel is also much easier to acquire in Season 4. In fact, it is probably the easiest to acquire out of all of the boss materials, I would say. And they kind of did a full 180 there compared to, for example, Season 2, when Living Steel was really hard to get. On top of this, you don't actually have to stay in Helltide all that much anymore in the future either, because Forgotten Souls are now no longer dropped from Helltide only. In fact, you get most of them from just salvaging items, or from random drops from elites, and also Fiend Roses are no longer a thing. You can still find them and click them, but they actually drop Angel Breath now. This is part of the homogenization of materials that I have done, so they've kind of like just gotten rid of Fiend Roses basically, and a bunch of other stuff. So this is not actually a reason to do Helltides anymore. Later on it's going to be mainly farming Living Steel for Gigar, for Andariel, and for Duriel and all that, but in the grand scheme of things, I don't think we're gonna spend too much time just doing Helltides, at least from an efficiency perspective. So here's the same character a little bit later when I was trying out Nightmare Dungeons, and you can see how the experience is just flying as I go through this dungeon here. So even like, you know, in 1 minute here, I can do like a third of a level at this point, you know, in 2-3 minutes, I can do like a full level up. Like one dungeon or so leads to like 2 level ups or something if it's like a bit of a longer dungeon, as you can see. It's kind of crazy how much XP you can get here. And compared to Helltide, it definitely felt a lot better just jumping straight into Nightmare Dungeons. Now, I did talk about how it's actually much easier now to even get to World Tier 3, and you can see this in action here right now. I mean, Rogue is relatively good at, for example, fighting the Curator with the range builds because precision exists and these kind of things. But in general, it definitely felt much easier, and I was able to go much earlier into Nightmare Difficulty as well than I would usually do this. Normally, this is like roughly like level 40 or so for me. Playing on hardcore, I was trying to generally be a bit more careful. But I think in the future, it is actually possible to do this quite early, especially on alts. On alts, you can do this probably at like level 10 if you want, because of those new tempered mods. But for like your first character in a season, you definitely have to like invest a little bit and you have to try a bit more. But in general, it seems like the difficulty is coming down and you can actually go very early to try to speed up the pace of leveling up to 100. And that's simply because your items are going to be so much more powerful on average compared to what they were in the past. If you look at this here right now, for example, this is like a level item power 191 ring, which is like a level 20 item or something like that I found here. And yeah, it has like 2 stats. It was a rare. I had two stats here with 3 life per second and 6 attack speed, which is kind of whatever. And then I tempered the item at the blacksmith and I got 51 marksman and critical strike damage. And you can do this with multiple items, and it's actually fairly cheap to do so if you do it with the right items and you pay a bit of attention to certain breakpoints. Here's another mod that I tempered here, just like marksman damage, and similar for other characters. You can do, you know, damage, I can do maybe some chance to cast certain things twice, and all these things actually scale really well early on because you don't really have much of this additive damage category that has kind of like the same affixes in different forms. You know, there's marksman damage, there's normal damage, damage to poison or whatever. You know, all these kind of things that exist right now that all go into the same category, and most of the glyphs go in that same category as well, but you don't have them that early. So those tempered mods on items are really impactful. When I put them on my gear, even with like whatever rolls, you know, I just didn't try to really min-max. I didn't try to like, you know, use my materials that I had. I was trying to keep it somewhat realistic, and I was easily doubling my damage output right before I went to the Cathedral of Light to do the Curator. Here you see, for example, my amulet as well, just a random yellow amulet that I was still wearing here at level 40 that I found again at like level 20 something or so with 235 item power. It just had movement speed, percent damage, and then I managed to put like 65 marksman critical strike damage on it. And those recipes are actually fairly cheap as well on low level items. So you can actually on purpose keep low level items around that you can then temper for very cheap and put some really strong mods on them as long as you find those recipes. And in fact, I did find that recipe while I was leveling up this rogue, and this is why I decided to use it for this test run. Another really important thing that I noticed is that there is a breakpoint here at, I think, item power 200 exactly, and you can see this here. So for example, I have this ring here, 191 item power, that costs basically nothing to imprint. You need like 20 ore and 5 rare crystal, and then I can imprint whatever Codex of Power aspect I want. But when this is a higher item power ring, here's for example 370, it does cost a legendary material. And those legendary materials are actually not that easy to get early on your first character. Later on, maybe you have a level 100 and this is your alt, you're not going to worry about this, you're going to be swimming in this stuff. But early on, you just don't find that many legendaries, and you also don't really complete all that many events that can drop them and so on. So what I actually did is I kept around this ring here and also an amulet with like 200 item power or less, and I was able to imprint them with some really powerful mods. And you can see the progression here as well for higher item power items. Again, here's for example a 547 chest, and it also costs 1 legendary material to imprint. And then at sacred items, there's another huge step up here, where now it costs like 30 ore, 35 crystals, and 5 legendary materials, and 2 forgotten souls. And at that point, it gets kind of tough to actually imprint anything with your items or temper anything, because you also have to use those materials for your tempering later. So in fact, what I did is I went to World Tier 4 with normal items equipped, basically, no sacreds. I had like a sacred weapon, okay, like 1 or 2 pieces. I tried to invest a little bit, But in the grand scheme of things, most of my jewelry was still normal. Most of my armor items were still normal unless they dropped with like good stats and a good imprint already. And I just try to preserve my materials as much as possible. And you can kind of see this progression here as well with enchanting items and rerolling as stat. So here's a 433 pair of pants, and it only costs 2 crystals and a bit of gold to roll. That is quite easy to do. So you can actually try to find a yellow and, you know, just put another really good stat on it, like extra crit or extra skill ranks to my main skill or something like that. There's a bunch of pretty good stuff that you can get early on. Also in the very low levels, for example, life per second and life per hit is pretty impactful because your total life pool is rather small and those stats don't scale as much as your total life pool scales later on. So while they're really bad in the late game, they're actually really strong in the early game. When you have 100 life and like 4 life per hit, and my puncture hits 3 targets, I heal for like 12% of my life per attack or something like that. Or other stuff here like energy per second, you can get mana per second, spirit per second. Every class has these kind of mods as well. You can roll them on helms, chests and boots, for example. And if you get like 2 or 3 of those mods early on, even on an item power 400 item or so, they can really help you out to smooth out the playstyle and just give you a lot more power early on. So TLDR for gearing up early on in the game in World Tier 2, going to World Tier 3. You want to try to keep a few items around that have less than 200 item power because those are dirt cheap to imprint and temper and anything. In particular the jewelry, because usually you try to keep like, for example, amulet or ring around, imprint like 1 or 2 or 3 kind of important offensive aspects for your build. Outside of that, you probably don't have that many materials and that much gold to really imprint and reroll your items all too much. But the lower these items, the better, the easier it is to actually temper and roll them. It's to the point where at least, you know, like high level normal items like 500 item power, for example, is actually pretty nice to keep around, even going all the way to World Tier 4. And the main thing you really want to focus on to replace is your weapon to make sure you have like a high DPS base that then scales all of your other damage. Another thing that I also noticed is that it can actually get very, very tanky early on as well. So you might wonder like, how do I actually do the Cathedral of Light level 30 on the Rogue? Well, that's also because you can now stack armor and resistances if you have temper mods on your items as well. So if you get lucky to find one of those recipes that allows you to stack armor, or for example, you roll your armor pieces at the enchanter to extra armor, you can get like 300, 400 flat armor or so just as a stat on the item, and you can do that on like 5 different pieces. Well, suddenly you're going to have like 70% physical damage reduction or something, and you not really have to worry about anything there. And likewise with resistances, if you have a lot of cold resistances going into the curator fight, for example, you wouldn't die like this. And you can quite easily just find one of those temper recipes if you're a bit lucky. And if you have, you know, 50% plus, 60% plus or so resistances, it's going to be a cakewalk going through this dungeon. It might be a bit slow, but you will survive easily. Here's an example of an item that I actually took, and it had the Juggernaut aspect, it dropped like this. And then I also rerolled this to extra armor, and suddenly I had like almost 850 more armor than before. And well, when you have 3000 armor or something like that at level 30, that's actually pretty good. You see here 77% damage reduction against those against monsters of my own level, of course. So against the level 50 monsters in the Cathedral, not as good as it could be. But you know, if you get closer to like 4k, 4.5k, 5k, I'm not sure exactly how much you actually need for the cap in level 50. But it will be somewhere around that value, I think. And suddenly you're going to take a lot less damage. Because if you go in there with like 1k armor, 2k armor, well, you're going to get blasted. So rolling this flat armor on my items was really impactful. And you can see an example here. I mean, I just take off this pants. I go from the 77% to 33%. Again, against level 30 monsters, not level 50. But you see this massive impact that even 1 or 2 of those items can make. And I actually found it very hard to try to cap my resistances without temper mods. In this test run, I did not actually find a temper recipe that allowed me to roll resistances. So I just tried to make do with the gems in my jewelry and maybe trying to roll like a resistance somewhere on my items. But when you have the temper recipe, if you actually find that one that gives you any of the resistances, and you just put this on like 5 different items, well, you're going to be easy capped on your resistances. And any kind of elemental damage is going to be a joke to you. In Season 4, more than ever, most builds will rely on purely armor and resistances as their survival tools. Damage reduction, for example, from chest pieces and pants is completely gone. It does not exist anymore. A few uniques still have it and so on. There are still defensive glyphs and Well, that's pretty much it. The rest is just life, resistance, armor, and this is all of your defense really, besides your skills, like, you know, if you use a flame shield or something like that, sure. But in the grand scheme of things, you can't really build like infinite survivability and just face tank everything in the game anymore in the future. And I think personally, another really good breakpoint to switch to the next difficulty after Nightmare is going to be around level 50, which is when you unlock Paragons. The Paragon jump at the start will not be as big as before, most likely because of the temper mods, because usually one of the big advantages of reaching level 50 is that you just get like 25 points directly from the start, and then you can get a bunch of like extra additive damage. There's always like a one additive damage cluster that every class has right at the start, and then maybe, you know, some extra damage, and then maybe a bit of armor or resistance or something like that. But in general, it's still gonna feel like a bit of a power spike reaching level 50. And then you get, you know, maybe plus 10-20% extra damage, extra toughness, and it definitely makes things a lot easier. So in my case here, for example, I tried to do it also very early in my test run. I was level 47 and Elias was quite a struggle, especially because, as I mentioned, I didn't actually manage to get those temper manuals to get my resistances up. So it was very hard to actually get, for example, fire and shadow resistance for this fight here, and it was kind of tough. But I did manage to reach Torment in around 3 hours in this test run, and it can be done way faster on an actual, you know, season start if you really try. And what's really good about actually getting to World Tier 4 very, very early is that then you can farm strongholds. In Season 4, we're gonna have 49 Nightmare Dungeons in the rotation, and there are a lot of them that are locked behind strongholds. So you kind of want to complete a bunch of them anyway, or if you're a druid, you probably want to do Turadura anyway, and these kind of things. And just in some cases, it's kind of nice to do them. But also, when you go to World Tier 4, you will get the 250% extra XP multiplier, but the monsters will not actually be any harder than they would be on other difficulties. In Strongholds, monsters always scale to +2 of your character level. As you can see here right now, this is World Tier 4 and there's level 49 monsters when my character is level 47. So this is kind of a good way to get a bit of XP and do some objectives that you kind of want to do at some point anyway, and kind of catch up on those levels to, for example, reach level 50, or, you know, just get a bit stronger before you jump back into the Nightmare Dungeon grind. Now, this will depend a bit on the build and your experience with the game. Level 50 is definitely quite early to go to Torment Difficulty. Usually I would recommend that more around level 60 or so, because you have just gained a bit more power, you gained more Paragon levels, you have already like probably your first legendary Paragon node online, maybe a glyph or two, and also like a lot more gear to choose from, a lot more legendary aspects and so on. So level 60 is a really good breakpoint as well, because this is the point where you can actually equip ancestral items. Before that, you are just going to be too low level and the maximum is sacreds. But if you actually find, let's say, a really good weapon that is ancestral compared to your sacred, you might actually deal something like double damage anyway, and that makes it much easier. And obviously, the more stuff you complete before hitting level 60, for example, you're also going to have more opportunities to, for example, find temper recipes. They seem to drop a lot from dungeon bosses. So as you, for example, unlock codex dungeons or maybe do these stronghold bosses, they might drop there as well. And these kind of things, you might actually find some temper recipes that can really make a huge impact. And from here on out, if you want to level fast to level 100, it's basically smooth sailing. So once you have reached level 60, you have unlocked a few temper manuals, your resistances are fine, and you can imprint whatever you want because you're not completely starved on all of the materials. At that point, you kind of like over the hill, you kind of like through the most difficult part, and you just sail to level 100 basically. And the good news is that with this experience buff, it's much faster than before. They've also buffed, for example, the experience gain from elixirs. There's now 8% XP elixirs instead of only 5%. And in general, they've kind of like brought down the cost of elixirs, I would say, and even instances, I think. So you could even consider, for example, popping an instance here and there as well for some extra XP when you found some juicy dungeons. Now, lastly, let's talk about the Nightmare Dungeons in particular as well. So here's some data that I mentioned at the start of the video from Rax. So he actually did it on the PTR, and in particular, Blizzard has buffed some of the Nightmare Dungeon events quite significantly so. So in the past, they used to be somewhat okay, some of them relatively decent, but most of the time you would kind of just like rush past them if you were after experience and leveling to 100 the fastest. But this has actually changed quite a lot lately. So you can see this here. Here's some data that he's collected. And for example, out of those dungeons that he was running, this might have, you know, not necessarily 100% accuracy here, I guess, because I guess there's not many runs per dungeon, and, you know, you kind of level up as you go, you get more experience as you go. But some of these dungeons are obviously better than others. So Sirocco Caverns, I guess, for people that have played past seasons, this comes as no surprise. It is somewhere here on the top. And there's other like really high density dungeons that are just really good for experience per hour if you look at this column H here. And there is actually quite a gap between the best and the worst dungeons, as you can see. So you see roughly it's like double the experience per hour when you farm one of the best versus one of the worst dungeons. And you have kind of like the top 10 or so, that's kind of like in a range of like maybe 20%. And you want to try to farm those the most and then kind of like not do the others very much. However, I guess in general it has kind of like come a bit closer together between the different dungeons because of those dungeon events. So this is just like kind of the raw data with just, you know, the dungeon. But then we look at the events here, there's some really crazy stuff. So you see here a cursed shrine, for example. While doing that cursed shrine for this 1 minute, you can get so much XP that this kind of comes out as like 184 like I think million XP per hour or so, which is quite a lot if you compare to even like the best dungeons. It's like twice as good than the best dungeon, just kind of, you know, cruising through the dungeon basically. And other events can also come kind of close. Here's 140, here's 107, 144, 157, and so on. So you see that all of these event experience values are extremely high compared to just running a dungeon without events. So whenever you find especially cursed shrines, cursed chests, and cursed wells, you definitely want to do them. But there's also some other good events here. For example, Immolation. This is like the event that spits out fire and then a bunch of enemies spawn around you all the time. It also seems to be somewhere on the same level as these events. But others are not necessarily as good, like Last Stand. But even the kind of bad events here, you see, they still have like more experience than even the Sirocco Caverns in the previous data set. So it seems like it will depend a little bit on the dungeon and which monsters spawn from that event. So sometimes there might just be like, you know, I don't know, little skeletons and maggots spawning kind of slowly, and they don't really give that much. But when there's like, you know, medium size or bigger monsters spawning, like, you know, Balrogs or the Khazra or something like that, then you will get a lot more XP from those events. And that will definitely be worth doing. On top of the rewards, where usually you get, you know, extra obols, you get extra, you know, maybe legendary items, extra materials. There might be boss materials now as well. These dungeon events can actually drop boss mats for, you know, living steel and blood and so on for the nether bosses. So they're also kind of worth doing for that purpose and not just the experience per hour. So in general, they are really good. But yeah, when it comes to really speed leveling, there might be, you know, some differences here with some of these events just not really popping off that much. But if you're like in a bad dungeon, they're definitely worth it. And in a good dungeon, they still seem to break at least even compared to just cruising through the rest of the dungeon. So this is the main takeaway. So in that case, a shout out to Rex for running this data. This was actually really helpful. And especially the events testing was kind of insightful here, I guess. So that is really interesting to see, because at least in the past, whenever I was doing like my world first race and stuff like that, usually events weren't really the thing. Now, last thing to consider here is also that as you approach level 100, you can go to the pit. And as soon as you complete Nightmare Dungeon 45 or 46, you unlock the pit and you can start getting those materials and then go into the pit. And the pit seems to be generally on the level of roughly the best Nightmare Dungeons as well. However, they cannot spawn any events there. They're kind of like just empty, you know, there's just monsters and nothing else going on. So it's very streamlined and you can't get these like insane spikes here. And events are actually very common in Nightmare Dungeons. So I don't know, almost every dungeon has at least a cursed chest or shrine, or some event. Some cases even multiple of those things at the same time. So a single Nightmare Dungeon can be quite packed. And especially if it's a short dungeon, but you get like 2 or 3 of those events, that can get to like really crazy experience values. I think that pit will be mostly a thing that you're gonna start caring about once you are actually level 100, because you also have to find the materials for it to even open it. It's not like the sigils where you just have a kind of infinite. I expect that the pit will be, you know, a bit of like a preparation needed basically. But also because of the lack of the events, it's just not really as good for leveling up. And you don't really care about masterworking items all that much early on. Also, another thing to consider is that you actually have to level your glyphs, and you kind of just want to like do nightmare dungeons as you level up, and then at some point just want to be done with them and move on to the pit and to the level 200 bosses and all that stuff in the end game. So nightmare dungeons is mostly just kind of like a leveling tool in the future, I think, as kind of like, okay, you are done with them at some point and you're not really going back. So in general, when you level up a character and you just focus on nightmare dungeons for the most part, and you generally farm plus 10 tiers of monsters compared to your character, then you will finish a few glyphs by the time you reach the 100. In Season 4, we don't know by how much this is getting buffed, and you're actually getting more glyph XP in the future. And now there's also, like, for example, a random positive mod you can get on sigils that gives you even more glyph XP. I think it's 20% or something, and it's like a bonus that appears sometimes as well. So in that case, I actually expect that if you mostly focus on nightmare dungeons, leveling up, at least starting at, let's say, level 70, 80 or so, all the way to 100, you're probably going to get done with all of your glyphs or most of your glyphs by the time you actually hit level 100. And you can kind of just like phase out nightmare dungeons and, you know, never come back. So that's in general how I expect things to go a little bit. We haven't been able to test this because of, you know, the lack of the buff of glyph XP that didn't make it on the PTR, but Blizzard has said that this is coming. So we'll see how much that will be. But I totally expect that, you know, with a fast build, if you farm T100 nightmare dungeons, which is really not a high bar anymore in Season 4 with the power creep, you can probably max out a glyph starting from 1 at, I don't know, less than 1 hour or something like that. So I totally expect you can, you know, do like your entire character's glyphs in like, you know, basically an afternoon if you really try. And compared to the past, this will be so much faster. In any case, that's it for my update on how to level up in Season 4. I'll probably gonna make this into like a more concise actual leveling guide when the time comes. For now, this is just like, you know, the impressions and, you know, the data and all that stuff that I've been trying to put together into this video to give you a bit of an update on how everything works in the future, because things are changing quite significantly, and a lot of people might be really surprised by, you know, the different power curve of the characters, and, you know, for example, how good are the Helltides, how good are the dungeons. So I try to kind of like put everything together here. In any case, I'm extremely excited for Season 4. I'm very much looking forward to also making a lot more guides for Season 4. I have a lot of stuff planned, so stay tuned. Hope you liked this video, and I'll see you guys next time.